This is 7 Daughters and 7 Sons, Part 3, Chapter 2. I returned to the house I shared with Jiha. I gave the letter I'd written 2 days before to the serving boy and told him to give it to Jiha. Then I dressed in the women's clothes I had picked up at the tailor's the day before. I had told him they were a gift for my beloved, and he had better take great pains to make them magnificent. I put them on. Their filmy silk felt strange against my skin, but not uncomfortable. I veiled my face heavily because I didn't want to be recognized when I went out into the street, and I didn't want to appear anything but a modest woman. My boys were waiting for me. I had sent for them earlier, and I had packed my things earlier, too. The packing hadn't taken long. I took no clothes, since I had no woman's clothes, except the ones on my back. All else I owned was suitable only for a man, and I couldn't be a man any longer. I was done with deception and the trouble it had caused. Not that I regretted my disguise. Without it, I wouldn't have had the courage to do what I had done, but I didn't need it any longer. I had outgrown it. I was Boran now, a woman, and content, in spite of my sorrow, to be so. The boys picked up my luggage. It consisted of money, essences, medicines, and jewels, though I certainly didn't tell them what my locked cases contained. We went down to the quay and boarded the dhow for Alexandria. It was the only ship leaving port that day. I had booked passage on it earlier that morning, again for my sister. It seemed important that I leave Tira immediately, not waiting for Gindar or some other caravan master to depart for Baghdad. I would make my way home from Alexandria. We arrived at the dock just in time. The captain had already delayed his departure half an hour, and would have waited no longer for us for fear of losing the tide. We set sail immediately. All day I had accomplished first one task, and then the next, without thinking, just making myself move forward on a prescribed path that had to be followed. The activity had been all-consuming. It had wiped out feeling. But now I was still. I stood on the deck, wrapped in a long abba, a cloak, my hands holding on to the railings, my veil blowing in the breeze. I watched the expanse of sea between the boat and the shore grow wider and wider, the ships in the dock grow smaller and smaller, the minarets and domes of the city disappear from my view. With a sudden flash of pain, as if I had put my hand in a fire, I realized that Tira was lost to me forever. Mahmud was lost to me forever. It was then that I began to cry. I cried steadily for 3 days. After Tira had sunk completely beneath the horizon, gone from sight as thoroughly as if it had never existed, I went down to the little ship's only cabin and stayed there. My servants slept on the deck with the sailors. One of them brought me food 3 times each day, and then took the tray away, untouched. But on the 4th morning, as I drifted across the border from sleep into wakefulness, I saw not my shop, nor the quay, nor my little white room, nor the palace of Tira, nor the deep-set eyes of Mahmud. I saw instead my father's courtyard, and my father's face, smiling as if in welcome, and my sister sitting in the courtyard too, arrayed in silks and jewels, and daintily picking sweets off a copper tray carried by a servant. I had sent a great deal of money home, secretly and anonymously, though of course my father would have guessed its source. That money could have made the home to which I was returning far different from the one I had left. Perhaps some of my sisters were already married. I couldn't wait to learn all that had happened to them. Suddenly I was happy to be going home. I had left part of my heart behind in Tira, but the other part had never left Baghdad, and that was the part I was going back to retrieve. I wrapped myself carefully in my abba and veil, and then I climbed up on the deck. I walked briskly all around it 6 times, taking great swallows of sharp salt air. After that, I went below and ate my breakfast. "You're better, lady," Sally said when he returned to the cabin and saw the empty tray. "Yes, Sally, thank you," I replied, smiling. "I thought at first you were seasick, but Musin said no. He said if you were seasick, you would have been throwing up. He said it was something else." Sully was very young. He did not know yet about the cool remoteness that supposedly characterized a proper servant, like Mahmoud's Faris, and I was certainly not the one to teach him. I had hired him because he was very large, very strong, and very willing to knock off the head of anyone foolish enough to look sideways at either me or my boxes. "Yes, Sully," I said. "It was something else. I'm over it now." But I wasn't. I'd never be over Mahmoud or my love for him. I couldn't imagine marrying another man. Praise God I didn't have to. I could take care of myself. I'd been spared a fate I'd always dreaded. I would never have to share the bed of a man I didn't want or who didn't want me. Our winds were fair, and the journey to Alexandria took us less than a week. When we docked, I remained aboard the ship and sent Musin, who was a bit older and a lot sharper than Salih, ashore for information. He returned in a few hours' time. "This is a good town," he told me. "The harbor is older and busier than the one at home. Scores of ships and caravans come and go each month, because from here goods are shipped all the way to the west, to Greece and Italy." How mysterious those names sounded in my ears, how romantic and strange. I wondered if there was a market in those places for essences and medicinal herbs. I had caskets of them with me. I knew that once I was back in Baghdad, I'd find a way to continue with my business. My father would help. We'd open up new markets and develop new sources of supply. Someday, years from now, long after Mahmoud would be sure to have forgotten his friend Nazir, I could even work again with Jiha. Gindar could be our intermediary. "In this city of many ships," I said, "I hope there's one leaving soon for Latakia or Antioch. I can get a caravan from one of the ports to Baghdad." Musin nodded. "Yes, lady. I found that out in the bazaar in 4 days' time. I also found a respectable khan and hired a suite of rooms for us." Musin had done a good morning's work. A pang of regret shot through me, though, as I pictured him wandering freely about the city, questioning the stall keepers in the souk, chatting with backgammon players in front of shops, sniffing the morning air without a veil between his nose and its freshness. All that was over for me. Well, regrets were useless. I had no time for them anyway. I would be busy every moment of my 4 days in Alexandria. I needed to learn everything about the city and the trading that was carried on from its khans, docks, and warehouses. After all, it was unlikely I would ever be back this way. I had to learn what I needed to know now, so that when I was ready to start buying and selling again, the information that would put me one step in front of Baghdad's other merchants would already be in my head. Besides, if I kept busy, my mind wouldn't have time for mourning Mahmoud. What my heart did was its own concern. Maybe a woman couldn't do business in the courtyard of a khan. but if she were rich enough and shrewd enough, she could hire others to move about for her and get on with her work perfectly well. Once we were settled in our khan, I sent Sully and Muzin to a cook shop to order a meal sent around to our rooms. After a week at sea, I longed for ripe, sweet peaches, tender green lettuce, and fresh, untainted lamb's meat. After they'd found some food, I told them they were to search out a tailor. I had nothing more than the clothes on my back, and I knew a woman of my station required an extensive wardrobe. They left, and then I sat, veiled, on the latticed balcony outside our rooms, watching the traffic on the street below. We weren't far from the harbor. I could see ships' masts, sails furled like tall, thin fingers reaching for the sky. There is something similar, the air, perhaps, or the light, about all towns near the sea. Alexandria was not altogether different from Tyre. After a while, I heard a knock at the door of the room. Sully and Muzin were still not back. I went to answer it myself, and when I opened it, I saw a young man standing before me. On his head he carried a brass tray laden with silver dishes. He was tall and straight, with finely cut features and an even head of dark curls. He didn't look like a cook shop waiter, though that was clearly what he was. Suddenly, my hand went to my mouth. I had put it there to keep from crying out. The cook shop waiter, I realized, with a shock that went through my whole body like a bolt of lightning, was my cousin. He was Hassan, eldest of my father's brother's 7 sons. Hassan? A cook shop waiter? Hassan, the marvelous merchant who sent packets of gold home to his father every other week? It was hard for me to believe my eyes, but I knew I must. I would have known Hassan if 20 years instead of 3 had passed since I'd last seen him. After all, I had once thought that I loved him. That was before I'd learned that love was something more than an attraction to a handsome face and an open manner. That was before I'd learned that love was the mingling of 2 souls. 2 years before, I would have screamed, "Hassan!" as soon as I laid eyes on him. But I was wiser now, and skilled at dissembling. I knew he wouldn't recognize me. He hadn't seen me face to face since I was a scrawny 11-year-old chasing after him in the courtyard. Now I was a tall, slender, richly dressed woman, my face scarcely discernible beneath layers of golden gauze. "Set the food on that table," I said, keeping my voice cool and impersonal. "Leave the covers on. I'll wait for my servants to return before I eat." "Yes, lady," he replied. His voice was polite, but not humble. It wasn't the voice of a man who had been born a servant. I decided to mention that fact. I crossed the room and stood beside him as he placed the dishes from the tray on the table. "Who are you, young man? You don't have the accent or the carriage of a cook shop waiter." He straightened himself up and faced me, a glint in his eye, a slight curl to his lips. I realized then that I wasn't the only woman who had noticed his fine dark eyes, his broad muscled shoulders, his long, shapely brown hands. If I had wanted my cousin Hassan, I could have had him at that moment. He was used to such encounters. But I didn't want him. "Oh, lady, as you no doubt suspect, I've come down in the world." His voice was light, as if what he said didn't matter. "I was born a rich man's son." "And your father lost his money?" That was hard to imagine. My uncle was rich enough to weather years of reverses. "Oh, no," he replied, still smiling in a way that implied our conversation was about something of no importance. His eyes conveyed the opposite message. My father's still a rich man. And he allows his son to work in a cook's house? He doesn't know, lady. He lives in another city. I have my pride, lady. I can't ask him for help, and I can't go home again either. Why not? I asked. But I knew my uncle well enough to know why. It wasn't pride that kept Hassan in Alexandria. It was fear. A frown darkened his face. Why do you want to know? A story will pass the time. I withdrew a handful of copper coins from my pocket and held them out to him. He took them. He took them eagerly. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. Instead, I sat down and gestured to him to do the same. He told me his story. It wasn't an unusual one. Between gambling and pursuing entertainers, he'd paid little attention to business. His luck changed. He began to lose heavily. Embarrassed to admit the truth, he spent the money he was supposed to be sending home or using for merchandise to pay his gambling debts or amuse his friends. He neglected the shop, and the people he'd hired to work for him stole from him at every opportunity, and their opportunities were virtually limitless. He guessed what was happening, but didn't have either the desire or the energy to tend to business himself. Soon it was all gone. Shop, merchandise, fine clothes, jewels, servants, women, friends, and all. But he knew his father and dared not go home. When he was done with the tale, his expression lightened. He actually smiled again. Well, lady, he said, what do you think of all that? Not much, I replied dryly. I don't regret it, he assured me. I had a good time. In some houses in Alexandria, the ladies haven't stopped speaking of me yet. Would you like to know why? For another few coppers. His voice trailed off suggestively. My gorge rose into my mouth. So this was what he had come to. For a few more coppers, he would sell even himself. Hassan, once I thought I loved you. And now I thought of his father and longed to weep. But none of my feelings were evident in my voice. Young man, I said, I'll give you more than a few coppers. I'll give you enough money to buy some merchandise and get yourself honorably home again. What do you think of that? A look of perfect amazement passed over his face. God be praised, he whispered. I was drowning, and now I've been saved. He stood up and walked toward me. Ah, lady, he whispered, I will love you as you have never been loved before. I stood up too, as quickly as I could, and held my hands, palms outward in front of my body. You misunderstand me, young man, I said coldly. I want nothing from you, nothing at all. That can't be, he replied. His voice was as dry now as mine. No one gives anyone anything for nothing. Perhaps you're right. A demon had seized me, a mischievous demon. I was possessed of a desire, not for Hassan himself, but for a kind of revenge. He'd laughed at me, and his father had laughed at my father. He'd thought he was better than any of us. I wanted to do something to him that would serve to remind him every day of the week that in truth he was superior to no one. I'll give you 100 dinars. What I ask in exchange is so little, really, a price so small as hardly to be considered a price at all. He shot me a suspicious glance. And what is that price so small that it's hardly a price at all? My name is Boran, I said. That wouldn't mean anything to him. My name was as common as sand. I want you to have my initial, B, tattooed just above your heart. That way, I know you'll never forget me. Every time you dress or undress, you'll see my initial and be grateful, I added sweetly. Grateful, he cried. Grateful? For being branded like a slave? For wearing a mark of shame as long as I live? You can take your 100 dinars and throw it into the sea so far as I'm concerned. But he made no move to leave the room. He just stood there, staring at me, his legs apart, his arms crossed on his chest. No one will see the mark, I said. So what difference can it make in your life? I think you're crazy to throw away 100 dinars. You must think you're crazy too, a sensible man like yourself. Here's your chance to show everyone what a clever, reasonable fellow you really are. He dropped his arms to his sides and took a few steps toward me. Lady, he said, his voice low, is there no other payment that will satisfy you? Is there nothing else I can do? I shook my head. Nothing, I said. I need nothing whatsoever, or at least nothing that you can give me. But I'd like you not to forget me. That would please me. And that's why I ask this very tiny little favor in return for 200 dinars. You said 100 just now. Did I? I meant 200. He clenched his fists tightly together, unclenched them, and clenched them again. You see before you a desperate man, he said at last. I accept your offer. That makes me very happy, I said pleasantly. The giving of charity is commanded by the Prophet. So is gratitude. We are both ensuring our entrance into paradise. Lady, Hassan replied quietly, I don't know what your motive is, but I know perfectly well what it isn't. It isn't to fulfill the commands of the Prophet. Perhaps some man wronged you once, and you take your revenge on me instead. Well, brother, I pointed out in what I'm sure was a perfectly rational style, no one is forcing you to accept my offer. If it's revenge I'm after, it's a revenge that costs you almost nothing. On the contrary, you gain enormously. He didn't reply. There was nothing he could say. Return to your cookshop now, I instructed. Come back in an hour. My servants will be here by then, and they'll see to the details of our transaction. Which they did, with dispatch, asking no questions and making no comments. But by the time the 4 days until the departure of the dhow for Latakia had passed, I had changed my mind about returning home immediately. Even for me, 200 dinars was a lot of money, and I wanted to recoup it. Judicious disposal of some of my jewels had retrieved the 200 dinars and more. I purchased a cargo of the best sesame oil. It had come from Aleppo by way of Antioch. Baghdad had plenty of its own sesame oil, but I could sell it at a good price in some other city. It didn't really matter when I arrived home. I had told my mother I would come when the autumn winds blew a third time. Seriously? It was not yet summer. Besides, she hadn't really believed me when I had assured her that I would return. No one expected me at any particular moment. No one really expected me at all. And though I longed to see my mother, my father, and my sisters with all my heart, I could postpone that pleasure for a few short months, while I shored up my fortune and experienced who knows what half-expected encounters in other towns. I didn't see Hassan again after that first day in Alexandria. He probably left for the east on the ship I decided not to board. I stayed in the city for about a week, all told, and then I boarded a dhow sailing for Cyprus. Although I had bought some clothes in Alexandria, my wardrobe was far from complete. One of the first things I did upon arriving in Salamis was visit the shop which, according to the information gleaned by Musin in the bazaar, was owned by the best weaver of the many fine weavers in this town and on the small neighboring islands. The man was in business in a big way. He scarcely put shuttle to loom himself, but instead marched up and down his big storeroom, inspecting the cloth brought to him by women who wove at home, making sure they didn't vary the traditional patterns by so much as a thread. He had assistants, too, who waited on the customers thronging his outer rooms, selecting yards of linen from his laden shelves. Accompanied by Sully and Musin, and dressed in trousers and shirt of fine scarlet silk, I entered the shop. One of the assistants caught sight of me as soon as we came through the door. Unceremoniously, he left the man on whom he was waiting and came toward us. With elaborate politeness, he bowed low. "Can I help you, lady?" he asked. "You've come to the right place if you seek the finest woven goods that Cyprus has to offer." "So I've been told," I replied. "Show me all your patterns." "Please to make yourself comfortable, lady," he said, escorting me to a kind of alcove equipped with rugs and cushions, where important customers could lounge, sipping cool drinks while fabric was brought to them. The young man scurried back and forth, lugging one bolt after another to show me. So anxious was he to please, and so quickly did he move, that sweat soon formed on his upper lip. But I took my time in making my choices. I wanted leisure to examine the young man carefully. When he first spoke to me, I suspected who he was. After an hour in his company, I was sure. Though he was only a weaver's assistant, his voice had a nasal superciliousness that condescended even when he was trying to be polite. He walked with a flat-footed gait, and his beard grew in sparse pale hairs from his pointed chin. Of all my uncle's sons, he was the one who looked most like his father. He was Hassan's next younger brother, my cousin Ali. I had never liked him. At last I selected several of the most expensive pieces of material for sale in the shop, and then I said, "Young man, I'll buy all of this stuff on one condition, and one condition only. You must deliver it to the khan where I'm staying yourself after you're done here." I pressed some money into his hand to make sure he agreed. "It'll be worth your while," I added encouragingly. He didn't fail me. Several hours later he came, just as instructed. Sully and Musin were in the other room. As I had with his brother in Alexandria, I told him how surprised I was to discover a man of his obvious rank and ability working as a shopkeeper's assistant. He, too, admitted that he had come down in the world. It wasn't gambling and women that had been his ruination. He had risked everything he had in backing the expedition of some clever scoundrel who claimed he knew the precise location of King Suleiman's mines, which he proposed to reopen. He had showed Ali maps of the route he would follow and supposed samples of the gold and silver lying on the ground in that secret place, just for the taking. Naturally, once he had Ali's money, and the money of who knows how many other poor fools, he had disappeared off the face of the earth. I made the same offer to Ali that I had made to Hassan, but I didn't have to increase Ali's bribe from 100 to 200 dinars. and Ali didn't blink once at my condition. "Bear your mark to show you my gratitude," he exclaimed. "Lady, I do not need a mark to remember what you are doing for me. I will never forget, but you cannot be sure of that. The condition is, as you say, nothing. No, that is not true," he went on, his hands trembling with eagerness. "It is not nothing, it is only right, only correct. I will go out and have it done immediately. I will return for the money before dark." I had never before seen anyone whose eyes glittered so brightly or whose nostrils flared so wide at the thought of a mere 100 dinars. He had the money in cash in his hot hands before dark, and so far as I know, was gone from Cyprus by dawn. I remained in Cyprus, buying and selling for another week, and then moved on. I sailed to Sidon, on the Lebanese coast, and after several days traveled by caravan inland, back to Damascus, crossing the vast, miraculous garden that careful irrigation had won out of the measureless sweep of desert Arabia, upon whose edge the city perches. The souks of Damascus were full of ivory inlaid wood, embroidered damask, Chinese silk, gum arabic from the south, Indian spices, lapis lazuli, and turquoise from Central Asia, and pearls from Bahrain. But I concentrated on perfumes and herbs, which were sold there in greater abundance than anywhere else. The herbs sold there now were the same as the ones being sold when I visited 2 years before, but I was different. Now I had things to offer that the Damascus dealers had never heard of. I remained in that marvelous town nearly a month. What I bought in Damascus I sold first in Tripoli and then in Antioch. Antioch is famous for its vineyards, but there was no demand for wine where I was going, so I left that product for the purchase by the traders heading for Egypt and the mysterious foreign cities of the West. Instead, I departed with vials of essence pressed from the lilies that fill the fields surrounding the city, and bales of licorice root. Finding a caravan traveling from Antioch to Aleppo was easy. I remained in Aleppo several weeks, using Musin and Salih as my go-betweens. I traded briskly with merchants heading south, west, and east. In the course of my 6 months journeying from city to city, I made nearly as much money as I had in the almost 2 years I'd spent in Tyre. I had gone to Alexandria by accident. It was the destination of the ship leaving Tyre at the hour I had to depart. I went to Cyprus ostensibly to market a cargo of sesame seed oil, although I had another purpose, which I didn't admit even to myself. But then I went to all those other cities, quite consciously aware that I selected them not because they were good business towns. I went to them because I knew they were the cities to which my uncle had sent my cousins. After the accidental encounter with Hassan and the half-accidental encounter with Ali, all the others were as I intended. I looked first in the bazaars, seeking the shops that my cousins were supposed to be running, but I never found them. Then I sent Salih and Musin to make inquiries after a young merchant who had arrived a year or 2 or 3 before from Baghdad, set up business, and failed. These inquiries were always successful. Then I arranged to meet my cousin, always simply as a customer of his employer, and always heavily veiled. Each one I rescued as I had rescued Hassan and Ali. Each one carried away from the encounter 100 or 150 or 200 dinars, and each one carried away as well my initial, the letter B, tattooed above his heart. In this way, nearly half a year passed. Winter was coming. I had enough money now to support in style for their entire lives my father, my mother, my 6 sisters, and all the children they would ever bear, to say nothing of myself, who would never bear a child at all. It was time for me to go home. Baghdad is far from the sea. To reach it, one must cross the desert by caravan. Women, as a rule, don't travel by caravan. Actually, as a rule, they don't travel at all, unless they're princesses sent to marry distant rulers as part of some political alliance. For this reason, when I sought caravan space, there was a high price asked of me. Yet, for generous consideration, the chief of the caravan traveling from Aleppo to Baghdad allowed me to join him, though I and my servants would remain apart from the others. Eventually, in the darkness, sitting by my campfire or in the courtyard of a khan, I did carry on conversations with some of my fellow voyagers, calling back and forth to them through the night. They were merchants, like me, and we had a great deal in common. I enjoyed these conversations, and so did they.